This winter, tens of millions of British citizens, including children, will be tipped or dumped into energy poverty severe enough to risk permanent damage to their health. Cold, damp houses provide the perfect breeding ground for mold that not only causes respiratory distress, but renders houses essentially unlivable once established. One left-leaning newspaper ran the story outlining the danger, but without a word about why this crisis has emerged. Because the woke moralizers of the environmental movement helped to create it. The narcissists of compassion, callow, self-aggrandizing, incompetent politicians, their celebrity lackeys, Machiavellian journalists, have insisted ever more loudly over the last 5 decades that no cost was and is too great for others to bear in the pursuit of blind service to the planet. It is irresistibly tempting at the moment for those on that bandwagon to single out and demonize Vladimir Putin for Europe's energy woes, but his current machinations were utterly enabled by the green ideologues. Anyone with eyes could see a decade ago that the idiot insistence that Europe make itself reliant on Russia for its energy security made the current situation inevitable. Remember when President Donald Trump, populist menace numero uno, was mocked and derided by the intellectual and political elite in Europe and North America for trumpeting precisely that warning? Well, now the chickens have truly come home to roost, but very little has yet been learned in consequence. Virtue-signaling utopians committed to globalization claim we are destroying the planet with cheap energy. Utility bills have soared in the UK, the home of the Industrial Revolution that lifted the world out of poverty. Now, up to half of small businesses in Britain face the risk of bankruptcy and closure. The government has had to announce a ruinously expensive energy price guarantee to mitigate the worst effects of this disaster: the rush to renewables. The mentality among the eco-extremists is as follows. If we have to doom the poor to destroy the system that made the rich, so be it. You just can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. But the tyrannical and emergency-justified panicked crunch is not just happening in the UK. In Spain, officials now dictate that commercial properties must not be heated above 17 degrees Celsius or cooled below 27 degrees Celsius upon pain of law. In Switzerland, similar punishments are being considered as part of a proposed 4-step plan for dealing with a gas shortage, which, quote, cannot be ruled out this winter given the geopolitical situation. The citizens of Germany, likewise, are now in phase 2 of a 3-stage emergency plan following a reduction in gas flows from Russia, its main supplier. The plan involves bringing coal-fired plants onto the market, according to German Minister Robert Habeck, despite them being, quote, simply poison for the climate, and the potential of gas rationing for industrial companies, so that supplies to homes and schools, etc., are not disrupted. The extended plan involves curtailing the Christmas lighting that constitutes part of the celebration in the midst of the winter darkness in many locations where they generally shine. Nothing, either beautiful or pleasing, is acceptable in the least to the Grinches, and the Grinch was in fact green when confronted by the crisis they created. Remember, when the aristocracy catches cold, the peasants die of pneumonia. If such extreme measures have become necessary in the richest countries, what in God's name is going to happen in the poorer ones? When the shortages strike, the poor will inevitably and necessarily turn to less green resources. Many, even in Germany, are already stockpiling firewood and coal for the winter, leading to acute shortages. How is incentivizing people to cut down and burn trees and use coal in their fireplaces going to help reduce the dreaded atmospheric carbon load? Perhaps we'll be able to comfort ourselves here in the West with the thought that the food we take for granted will still be available at our tables. But wait, the crops that nourish our populations cannot be grown without fertilizer, loathed by green folk, and more specifically, without ammonia. And what, pray tell, is ammonia derived from? Could it be natural gas? And how many people are dependent for their daily bread on the industrial generation and consequent wide availability of ammonia? Only 3 or 4 billion. What happens to the continuous production plants responsible for making ammonia? They destroy themselves, as they were not designed for such an unlikely event, and they cannot be restarted. The World Bank itself has recently indicated that 222 million people are already experiencing the threat of starvation, described oh so nicely as food insecurity. We've barely begun to implement the Save the Planet nightmare. We are told an emergency confronts us, the climate crisis. The solution? The masses will have to tighten their belts to forestall an even worse future catastrophe. The elite academics, think tanks, and corporate consultants, and the politicians who subsidize their intellectual pretensions will not be particularly affected by such tightening, privileged as they are. But the actual poor? To such an elite, they must be sacrificed now to save tomorrow's hypothetical poor. And 222 million people is no doubt an underestimate. As the food insecurity gets more severe, more countries will place restrictions on food exports. That will harm the international supply lines we all depend on. French and Germans have already done on the energy front and cut their farmers off at the knees, who will in turn stop growing food, not out of spite, but because of dire economic impossibility. Then we will have engendered the kind of feedback loop that can really spiral out of control. It will be poor people who die first, at least. But as we have all been taught by the malevolent eco-moralizers, the planet has too many people on it anyway. Think about this while you shiver all too soon in your cold, damp, and increasingly expensive and now substandard lodgings. You and your family may well have been deemed an expendable excess. If you dare to claim the moral high ground while serving the cause of starvation, then, by my reckoning, you've placed yourself firmly in the enemy camp, and you richly deserve whatever is coming your way. In the psychological and educational arenas, too, we demoralize young people, feeding them a constant diet of concretized apocalypse, focusing particularly on tempering or even obliviating the laudable ambition of boys, hectoring them into believing that their virtue is nothing but the force that oppresses the innocent and despoils the virginal planet. And if that doesn't work, and it does, then there's always the castration awaiting the gender dysphoric, and you oppose such initiatives at substantial personal risk. But we can reassure ourselves with the fact that a beneficent government is going to set up warm spots in public libraries and museums this winter, so that freezing, starving old people can huddle together to keep warm, while their grandchildren cough up their lungs in their frigid, damp, and moldy flats. In the face of such mandatory privations and manipulations, it's obvious that the last thing our tyrannical, idiot, panicked, virtue-signaling governments should be doing is directing their demented attention toward regulating what people serve at their tables. But because meat has also been deemed yet something else that is destroying the planet, the woke narcissists of compassion are already insisting that people eat less of it. Plants and bugs for you and your children, peasants, and the sooner you get accustomed to it, or else, the better. Let's turn our attention to the claim that animal husbandry and the meat it produces cheaply enough for everyone to afford is unsustainable. For a moment, because we haven't yet dispensed with enough moralizing and authoritarian stupidity. Remember what happened the last time that government agencies applied their tender mercy to determining what the people they serve should consume? We were offered the much vaunted food pyramid, telling us to eat 6 to 11 servings of grains and carbohydrates a day. with protein and fat at the pinnacle, something to be indulged in with comparative rarity, if indeed necessary at all. That all turned out to be wrong, and not just a little wrong, but so wrong that it might as well have been not just wrong, but a veritable anti-truth, something as wrong as it could possibly get. The food pyramid was brought into being not least by the US Department of Agriculture, that is, by marketers, not scientists or nutritionists, with no shortage whatsoever of lobby effort by those whose products ended up being promoted. The dietary recommendation to prioritize carbohydrates produced a veritable epidemic of obesity and diabetes, resulting in what has been deemed by reliable researchers as one of the worst public health disasters of all time, dooming almost the entire Western population to a lifetime of catastrophic chronic health problems. And the rise in such illness and cost is directly associated with the beginning of the God-forsaken top-down dietary guidelines that set us all on a carbohydrate-heavy dietary pathway. There have been, in addition, dozens of studies debunking the claim that red meat causes disease. The PURE study, P-U-R-E, published in the journal Lancet in 2017, analyzing 140,000 individuals from 18 countries, revealed that, quote, higher carbohydrate intake, not meat and fat, note, was associated with an increased risk of total mortality, and that, quote, higher saturated fat intake was associated with lower risk of stroke. Lower. That is exactly the opposite of what we have been told by the beneficial centralizing agents who task themselves with determining what we, as sovereign and responsible individuals, should put in our mouths. But what of the argument that animal husbandry is killing the planet? Well, the American Environmental Protection Agency estimates that all farming produces only 11% of greenhouse gases in the US. Transportation produces 27%. Livestock accounts for 3%. And plant-based agriculture? 5%. And produce a hierarchy of responsibility that extends necessary purpose to everyone individually at the family and community and state level, and that serves as a necessary bulwark against the blind and Luciferian, prideful, intellect-based, top-down tyrannies of emergency and compulsion that will otherwise necessarily reign to get our individual acts together, to take on some real moral responsibility instead of falsely broadcasting unearned virtue far and wide and so cheaply and carelessly.